Okay, welcome. Today on Monsterology, we're going to be talking about fairies. And you might be thinking, well, fairies aren't monsters, but there was a lot of debate about the status of fairies. For example, King James thought that they were in fact demons, and there was a sort of a taxonomy of fairies in the Celtic tradition. Some were thought to be angelic or good or helpers, and others were thought to be demonic and evil. So we're going to explore this. One of the places to start, I think, is most famously with Arthur Conan Doyle. And many of you know that Conan Doyle created Sherlock Holmes, one of the great rationalists of all time. But the author himself was given to a kind of supernaturalism later in life and was very much interested in proving the truth of spiritualism, which was the idea that certain mediums could contact the dead. And so during a seance, you could actually have some kind of communication with your deceased loved ones. In an attempt to sort of strengthen the case for spiritualism and the supernatural generally, Conan Doyle looked to the phenomenon of fairies. And in 1920, in the early 20s, 2021, a couple of images emerged which purported to show two young girls playing with fairies. And these photographs were very intriguing, and Conan Doyle had them published in the newspaper with an article about fairies being real. And this basically created an incredible phenomenon around these fairies. So on today's episode, we're going to talk about fairies generally, and try to understand their context in the sort of pantheon or the sort of animistic traditions of spiritual beings. All right, welcome. All right, here's the image that I'm drawing for today, and you can see I have a fairy, one of the wee folk, as they were called in Scotland, riding on a grasshopper of some kind. I'm going to show you how I did this drawing with some traditional graphite pencils. This pencil I'm using is pretty dark. I think it's a 5B or a 7B. And you lay in the drawing very lightly with something much harder, like an HB or a number 2 pencil. And then when you get to the real drawing and the rendering, you want to go with a much darker pencil, a softer pencil, which gives you those really black values that you want eventually. So you'll see me doing this throughout while I explain the history of fairies. And maybe the place to start is just with the word fairy, which some scholars have linked to the word fates and the meaning of the fates that come out of ancient Greek mythology. The fates, you may recall, were 3 female personifications of destiny. They were called the Moirai in Greek and Parca in Roman, in Latin. And they don't control all your actions, like you have free will, but they do control when you're born, when you die, and then how much you suffer, like what degree of suffering your life is going to come with. Apart from that, you have some free will. And there were 3 of them. Nona spins the web, or the thread of life, rather. Decima measures the length of it, and then Morta cuts the thread and determines the manner of your death. I think the fairy tradition really is strongest in the Celtic cultures that emerged in Europe and particularly in Northern Europe and island cultures. You find fairies in Slavic cultures, in Germanic, in English, French. I think the Celtic tradition, though, would include the Britons, the Gauls, the Galatians, the Gaels. And these were, continental tribes, but most of them were wiped out or absorbed by the Roman Empire as it grew. Whereas the islands, the Gaels, that culture sort of survived more. I mean, famously, I'm sure many people know that Emperor Hadrian, built a wall, and the Scots were, the Romans could go no further north, and the Scottish people are sort of very proud of this fact that they were able to hold the Romans at bay. Although, as it's oftentimes pointed out, the wall also allowed the Romans to keep the Scottish out as well. So there's that kind of fun tension historically. But you'll find fairies in other cultures too, they really are a part of the animistic tradition and polytheistic traditions that you'll find in, for example, Japanese Shinto. So the kami are Japanese spirits. You'll find them frequently in Hayao Miyazaki anime films. These are spirit beings that live in the forest, and they are basically fairies. The Thai also have these supernatural spirits. In Cambodia, where I lived, these were called Nekta, and in Thailand they're called Pi. In Burma they're called Nats, and of course Native Americans have forest spirits too, living, all through the natural ecology that they're sort of dealing with. So trees and rivers and forest and so forth. And Hinduism, there are the devas too, some of which populate the forests. So there's a kind of convergence of multiple folk traditions here. Now, what are the origins of fairies? This is an interesting question. My own view is I sort of take an evolutionary view of all this stuff, as many of you who follow this channel and watch my other episodes will know. I look to cultural evolution to sort of try to understand how did these monster folk traditions evolve and emerge. And animistic cognition, I think, is very ancient. All of us started out as animists. We saw personalities in the forests and in the trees, and only slowly through what we call scientific literacy did we sort of wean ourselves off this way of thinking. Unlike others, I actually think this kind of animistic cognition is really valuable and still legitimate. And I don't look down my nose at it. I think it's as valid in some cases, particularly regarding social issues. It's as valid as scientific thinking. It's a different kind of rationalism. But I think if you imagine yourself encountering the forest, get yourself out of your city-dwelling culture, and imagine living in the woods, then you would see it as a landscape of fear and curiosity. Nature is loaded with stuff that could kill you. Wolves, bears, creatures that could basically annihilate you, give rise to folklore like giants, witches, and so forth. But also there's a sense that the forest is friendly. There are friendly animals, for example, and the forest has hunters in it, which mean you no harm usually, and it's a very easy sort of move to extrapolate that to sort of invisible beings like fairies or maybe dwarfs and gnomes and this sort of thing. So I think, a natural encounter with the woods, with the kind of brains that human beings have, would produce this kind of folklore. And in the pagan tradition, a lot of these things were deities. They were spirits, sometimes of another realm, or they were spirits of the dead. And this is very common in the animism of Thailand and Cambodia. The spirits that are inhabiting the woods are, in fact, could be your dead relatives. In the Christian tradition, as Christianity grew in the Roman Empire and made its way through Europe, it demoted, these gods and treated them differently. So in a way, fairies were then treated as somehow connected to the angels, maybe fallen angels or corrupted angels or just lesser angels, or they were thought of as demons. They had a kind of power to deceive people. This is where the word glamour comes from. In the Scottish tradition, glamour, which is a corruption of the word grammar, was a kind of spell or enchantment that the wee folk or the fairies could employ to take a human into another realm, or at least deceive them as if they were in another realm. So there's many stories in fairy folklore where a person is basically out in the woods and they imagine themselves going to another land and having an adventure and maybe becoming rich, and then they sort of wake up in a field back to normal, having had this kind of strange psychological adventure. Now, one wonders how much, since this is a land of great sort of single malt whiskeys and fantastic scotch, one wonders how much alcohol is involved in some of these wonderful stories about these supernatural adventures. And even the Scottish writers themselves sort of speculate. One thinks about Walter Scott, the great Scottish writer, who also thought, well, some of these fairy stories are intimately connected to drinking at the pub. So anyway, if we could do a quick sort of sketch of the history, King James thought the fairies were demons and they consort with witches, and this is published in his Demonology of 1597. So he took a very dim view of the wee folk. But then Walter Scott sort of argued, in the 1820s that fairies derive really from the Roman Sylvans tradition, which are sort of, spirits of the woods like Pan, fauns, and so forth. And they carry off children. Some fortune tellers and shaman healers, were thought to visit fairyland. And also there was a tradition of changelings, like they could take a child, your child, and then replace it with another child that looks like yours but is in fact not your own child. Then there was some thought that they might be astral spirits betwixt, or between angels and man. And then in 1911, the anthropologist Evans Wentz, who later went on famously to sort of translate or really compose the Tibetan Book of the Dead, he was fascinated by Celtic fairies and wrote a dissertation on this, faith in Celtic countries. And that sort of triggered an interest in fairies by the Theosophical Society. Many people know that in the 1910s and 20s, the Theosophical tradition was very big in America and in the UK. And this sort of pairs nicely with the Charles Fort and the Fortean approach to life. Charles Fort in 1919 wrote the Book of the Damned, which was really a set of observations and folklore stories and supernatural stories that didn't fit well with the scientific era of the early 20th century. And Fort thought that there were fairy crosses that could be found. And these were actually crystals, and you could find them in the eastern U.S., and that they looked almost like a crucifix that was in a crystal. And he thought this was the product of fairy culture. And these were tiny creatures, and he even mentions in the Book of the Damned that sometimes you'd find crucified cockroaches, and this must be the work of the fairies, which is just an amazing observation that amuses me greatly. And he thought that there were these little flints, too. I mean, this is actually observed. There are these tiny pygmy flints or microliths that can be found all over the Americas and Europe. And he wondered, why are these, little flint blades so small? We now think that they're basically just arrowheads, very small arrowheads. But he thought, well, this is the product of fairy culture. And then famously in the 1920s, as I started out this episode, Arthur Conan Doyle basically writes Coming of the Fairies, Theosophical views of fairies in 1922, and that was about the fake photos. The girls who created the photos kept it, a secret for decades, but finally in the 1980s, one of the girls admitted that they had basically hoaxed the whole thing and that they were having fun, but it wasn't, malicious. They knew that people wanted to believe in this, and they were just having fun. But it did create this terrible sort of reputation for Arthur Conan Doyle as becoming, just exceedingly gullible at the end of his life. That's sort of a good place to wrap up this episode. All right. If you enjoy this kind of thing, then please hit the subscribe button and come back for more content. Take care.